Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us. It's our second session in our new sub-series, Marx and Party Building. We thought we're spending about 10, 12 sessions. We'll see how these things go on the question of Marx and Engels' involvement with practical party politics. There's this misconception that Marx and Engels spend their time just sitting in the library and writing stuff, which they did a lot of. Anybody who's got the collected works at home will know, but they also got involved very, very actively in a number of organizations. And tonight, pleased to have Kevin Bean with us, who's talking about, the title of the talk is From the Communist League to the First International. So without further ado, fire away.
Okay, thanks, Tina, and thanks, comrades, for the invite to take part. I've put a number of links up on, I hope they've gone up onto the page, and these are links to the Marxist Internet Archive. So you should be able to just click onto them and go to some of the things I'm referring to. One of the reasons is that quite a lot of the material, which was perhaps more widely available in book form in the past, is now largely held on internet archives. So a book like this one by David Fernbach from the early 70s, which was quite widely available, in mainstream bookshops, particularly in universities, is now quite difficult to get hold of. So I'm going to refer to some of the documents, because one of the things I hope that comes out of the sessions is that you actually look at what Marx and Engels write, and that you try to look at what they're saying and the ways that they say it. So this is really designed to sort of take us back to basics in that sense, but also many of the documents and many of the things that we're looking at are not often covered, or at least not deeply studied, I think, by many people on the left. Comrades on the left have many sort of good summaries. And indeed, if you look at on most left groups, there will be articles and material about this. But I think it's always useful to go and look back at what Marx and Engels actually said themselves. These sessions are really looking at the idea of what Marx and Engels thought about the idea of party and program. And I suppose because this is an important issue for us at the moment, both in terms of what we mean by a party, indeed what sort of program it should have and how it should be built, and indeed its relationship with all sorts of other movements, that these are often quite urgent questions. But what I'm not suggesting that we do is simply take Marx's, particularly Marx, because he's more directly involved in this initial period, take his practice as a sort of blueprint and just say, well, let's just repeat it. Because in many ways, I think, certainly in the First International, Marx and Engels are sort of finding their way. And much of what they do, particularly towards the late 1860s, is a sort of response or a development, not only of their earlier work, but also a recognition of some sort of changes and some of the experiences. So that, for example, as we will come to in a few sessions' time, what happens in Germany with the creation of clearly social democratic parties which are formally and then largely become committed to Marxism, very different experience, I think, than the Marx encounters in England, or indeed in some of the other French-speaking countries that will be important in the international. So I think what we're looking at here is in some ways the development of Marx's ideas, both from sort of first principles, but also in terms of practical experience. What I want to begin with, and it is on the link, it's a letter that Marx wrote in February 1860 to an old comrade, Freiligrath, who's a poet and a former revolutionary. And the letter is in full, but I'm going to summarize the main points of it. It's perhaps not clear what's going on with the letter, because it actually refers to a series of criminal cases and trials in which all sorts of accusations are being made against Marx and indeed other people. And that doesn't necessarily concern us. But what Marx says in the letter, he says, since November 1852, that's 8 years ago, when on my suggestion the Communist League was dissolved, I've not belonged to any secret or open society, and thus the party in this ephemeral meaning has not existed for me for the past 8 years. I am convinced that my theoretical work benefits the working classes more than participation in any sort of league or for which the time is past on the continent. If you're a poet, and Freilingrat was a poet, I am a critic, and I really have enough of the experiments carried out between 1849 and 1852. The League, like hundreds of other societies, was an episode in the history of the party, which is growing spontaneously everywhere on the soil of contemporary society. This letter was was known to people in Germany. It actually appeared in a summary form in Die Neue Zeit, the SPD's theoretical journal, just before the First World War. And quite a lot of the material that may well be new to us was actually reprinted. And so many German Marxists, for example, were aware of these discussions. But I want to just look at a couple of phrases in there, and particularly the idea of the party. And comrades, I think, will be aware that in the 19th century, when not just Marxists, but others used the term party, they used it, I think, in a very different way than we do. They used it, I think, to mean a very broad current. And we know, for example, on previous sessions where we've looked at the manifesto of the Communist Party, that at that stage, Marx and others consider the Communist Party to be a sort of broad current of communist ideas rather than a clearly organized party as we would understand it. A group like the Communist League, and indeed other groupings of that sort, would have a much clearer definition as an organization. So when Marx is talking about the party, which is growing spontaneously everywhere on the soil of contemporary society, he actually means that the ideas associated with the Communist League and indeed of scientific communism are developing spontaneously, and in particular in relation to the growth of industry and the growth of an industrial proletariat. But it's also important to note that there is something of a hiatus in Marx's political activity between the early 1850s and 1864. And these are not years in which he sort of takes a holiday or he goes off and discovers himself, as it were, but a period when he's writing. For example, quite a lot of the economic work that will form Capital is being written in this period, late 1850s to the early middle 1860s. But it's interesting that he sees more value in developing theoretical ideas, and much of this is to do with, I think, the sense that the real living movement has been defeated, and that it is now important to try to analyze and particularly to look at the nature of society. The Communist League, and again, I think comrades will have picked up some of this from the discussion last week, was a small grouping. But by the early 1850s, it had some adherents in France and in Germany, but its main existence was as an exile group in London. And as a small theoretically formed grouping, it was developing, very high level of politics. It's there that Marx is sort of testing out his ideas, and indeed it's an explicitly communist grouping. But what Marx, I think, is now looking at is to see how the ideas of communism, particularly those which he's developed already in both the Communist Manifesto, can now apply to the new situation. He's building, in a sense, on the experience of 1848 and the Communist League. But what I think he begins to understand in the early 1860s, and certainly it comes across in 1864, is that we are now in perhaps a new period in which there's a reawakening of that movement. Now, the changes that occur in Europe, well, in fact, internationally, between the early 1850s and the 1860s, are not just the growth of industry and the growth of a proletariat in the major industrial countries, France, Belgium, Germany, Britain, to a certain extent in Italy and Spain as well, but much less so. But also the growth of workers' organizations. For example, in Britain from the late 1850s, the growth of trade unions, initially quite local, but then taking on national form and extending into new groups of workers. And this is a clear sign, again, of a developing type of movement. The other aspects which are important is the growing sort of revival of the demand for the right to vote. And so movements for extending the suffrage, again, building on Chartism, but taking a very different form, again, are also coming to the fore. The formation of the Reform League in 1866, I think, is an example of that. But the other changes, I think, are perhaps geopolitical, to use the rather grand term, but particularly the growth of national movements in Europe. Remember that 1848 had both a social and a national dynamic. So that, for example, demands for the unification of Italy, particularly from radical demands of the sort that would give rise to Garibaldi and Mazzini, or their types of nationalism, but also the emergence of sort of state projects. So, for example, a series of national wars in which France supports the Piedmontese in their attempts to reunify areas of Europe, areas of Italy under their control. So the national question, particularly in relation to Italy and, of course, to Germany, the early 1860s sees Bismarck becoming minister-president of Prussia, and from that time onwards, beginning a policy of unifying Germany under Prussian control. In 1866, there is a war between Prussia and Austria, which is, again, marks, I suppose, the real emergence of Prussia. So in terms of the world of the 1860s, there's a lot happening, and a sense that the reactionary period after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions, the crushing of the revolutionary movements, the disintegration of Chartism, has now been placed by dynamic forces, both in terms of ideas of democracy, but also of the working class as well. And then, of course, the American Civil War in the 1860s is again a significant feature. So the important point here, I think, is that Marx is, in a sense, drawn back into activity by these developments, and indeed, I suppose, begins now to think, how can the ideas of communism and how can the working class movement be taken forward? One of the things that I perhaps want to discuss over the whole course of the sessions, I mean, I will be doing some, other comrades will as well, but it's particularly about the sort of arguments about socialist consciousness and about how people become not just socialists, but revolutionaries. And in particular, when Marx in that letter says that the party is growing spontaneously everywhere on the soil of contemporary society, comrades will remember that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx does sketch the development of class conflict, and he talks about that building to a height, and the way that the workers will combine in trade unions, they will grow aware of their class consciousness, and from this revolutionary politics will develop. Now, that has often led to a debate along with other Marxist texts, for example, in terms of the German ideology on the question of social consciousness and social being, about whether Marx in this period, or indeed Marxists in general, have this sort of idea of inevitability. In other words, that capitalism and its exploitation will inevitably create particular types of class consciousness. And it's very clear from Marx's own political activity that he didn't view that. I mean, otherwise, why did he spend time editing newspapers, forming groups, and in a sense trying to educate and persuade? So he certainly had what we might think of as a sort of revolutionary project, and the idea that to develop a working class movement was not simply an inevitability that would flow out of capitalism. You can certainly look at the sections in the Communist Manifesto, which are very inspiring. They're brilliant literature, but they are written, I suppose, somewhat in the heat of a moment, and the that implication of a sort of determinism can be read into them. But I think in practical terms that Marxists, like a whole range of people involved in politics, see politics as some subject action and agency. Now, we might argue about the nature of that agency, and indeed we might argue about the nature of the consciousness of the working class, what will come up later on, particularly in the discussions, I think, about about Lenin's work and what is to be done and the interpretations of that, is this argument about how far this consciousness develops, and indeed the role of organized activists and politicians, and indeed the whole issue of the intellectuals, those who've thought and developed ideas, and their relationship to political movements. So Marx is, in a sense, developing these ideas, and the First International is a good example of where this may be the case. I would argue that, for example, the Communist League was clearly an attempt at a propaganda group that was developing ideas which would then go out to a wider movement. And Marx's debates with Weitling and others in the 1840s and 1850s is a good example of where that, I suppose, to use the phrase, that sort of praxis is being developed. Now, the First International was not an initiative undertaken by Marx. I'm sure quite a lot of comrades are aware of that, but it's important to say that Marx was invited along. The original sort of elements of it were the connections between French and British workers, which had arisen in the early 1860s, and groups of French and British trade unionists wanted to cooperate together, particularly on matters of mutual interest, but particularly on questions of strike breaking, the way that employers might bring in workers from other countries to break strikes. So initially, the links were between sections of French and British trade unionists. There were also one or two others. The chair of the meeting, Professor Beasley, was a positivist, I suppose, a sort of social reformer. And there were other sort of elements who considered the idea of a group that linked up the interests of working men, and the language of the time indicates, I suppose, its limitations, of working men, you know, in the interest of the working class. The meeting in September 1864 again sort of came out of a number of protest movements and campaigns, particularly movements, for example, in sympathy and solidarity with Poland, which was then largely part of the Tsarist Empire. There were elements of Poland in Prussia and also Austria-Hungary, but solidarity with there, obviously with the American Civil War, and also, I suppose, the growing question in Britain of the franchise, and whether workers or sections of workers would get the vote. Now, if you look at the letter that's dated the 4th of November 1864, which is from Marx to Engels, Marx is quite excited about this, and he writes to Engels. He's already been, since the meeting took place in, I think, mid-September, he's already been involved in a series of meetings, and again, he's drawing up documents and involved in committees and so on and so on. So he's been fairly busy since the foundation meeting. And he writes to Engels that he says that I knew that this time real powers were involved both on the London and Paris sides, so that this wasn't just someone proclaiming, you know, a new movement, that it actually represented something. And he talks about it being a real power. But he outlines the meeting, and he talks about the sort of people that are there, who he describes in quite colloquial terms as fine fellows, nice lads, and he runs through them, people that Engels would have known as well, you know, trade union leaders who will later become quite important in the First International. But he goes on to say, it will take time before the reawakened movement allows the old boldness of speech. It will be necessary to be, and this is where my very bad Latin, I'll have to apologize for this, like all my languages. It will necessary to be fortiter in re, suaviter in modo, which is variously translated. It's actually the motto of a school very near where I live. Strong indeed, or strong in essentials. Re is a bit of a difficult one sometimes, but strong indeed, gentler in style. And that sort of idea of maybe adapting and maybe trying to relate your ideas to the audience, and the degree to which you might shape and refine your ideas, and indeed how far you could go in developing revolutionary communism to a particular audience, is an interesting one. And again, this of course is very similar to debates in our own day about whether you know, certain types of maximum demands and the idea of transitional politics, and whether we put forward particularly you know, particular demands in, you know, particular ways. I'll leave it at that because it's a theme I'm going to look at, and what I would ask comrades to do is particularly look at the documents that Marx wrote for the First International, and see how they weigh up, both in terms of that phrase, but also in terms of, you know, Marx's earlier writings like the Communist Manifesto, which obviously is designed for a very overtly revolutionary period. And also to contrast Marx's writing in this period with what he's writing, for example, in the Civil War in France, or the critique of the Gotha program, when the German socialists come together in that way. There was a provisional general council or committee was established pretty early on, and Marx was brought onto it. A number of people were given the job of writing rules and addresses. And when these came back to the committee, Marx saw them and was very critical, and was in the end given the job of drafting them, and they were generally accepted with some minor amendments. Again, I have, I'm fortunate enough to have the minute books here of those meetings, which show the sort of to and fro, and these will be available in some libraries. But the Marxist Online Archive has got some sections of them, but I'm afraid Lawrence and Wishart have asked others to be taken down, so the picture's a little incomplete. Marx described his inaugural address as a sort of review of the adventures of the working class since 1845. And it's very clear that in this, there are the echoes of the Communist Manifesto. So, for example, it begins with quite a long outline of the growth of capitalism and the fact that capitalism has expanded wealth and production. And you will see there the focus on the gulf between the wealth of industry and the growth of capitalism and the poverty of the working class. And that is clearly, that's clearly influenced by the arguments of the Communist Manifesto. But it is certainly a more cautious language. But it also brings through some of the key ideas. So again, Marx surveys the gains that the working class have made and refers, for example, to the way that the combinations of workers, trade unions and protest movements and others have managed to secure some gains. For example, the 10-Hour Act, where he talks about the political economy of the working class in confrontation with the political economy of the bourgeoisie. Now, that would seem to us a fairly sort of straightforward, idea. But of course, for many of the trade union leaders, and indeed even for some of the more ostensibly radical French Proudhonists, you would find a certain sort of a set of assumptions that often, in a sense, incorporated capitalist common sense. In other words, that they were arguing for a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. They didn't, for example, attack bourgeois political economy. They just wanted their fair share of it. So in putting forward that argument, Marx is clearly saying, well, there's the interests of the working class and those of the capitalists are rather different. The carryover from, I think, the Communist Manifesto was the focus on politics, and in particular the argument that to conquer political power has become the great duty of the working classes. And this in particular is linked to the interventions of the working class movements in what is in effect foreign policy. So, for example, the protest movements about Italy, protest movements about Poland, and above all, the protest movements, the protest movements around the American Civil War. I'm afraid I can't keep up with the chat that goes on, but I can see that Matthew is, basically putting the correct view about the importance of the Civil War for the First International. And in particular, Marx's argument, and I think this is quite important, is not only the heroic sacrifices of sections of the British working class in Lancashire, but also the direct intervention restrains the British ruling class from siding with the South. Not only did the mill owners have their own interests in terms of siding with the South, but the British ruling class had very close connections with the South, and indeed saw, and indeed as would have seen the Confederacy as a probable sort of protectorate for British imperialism. So that, I think, is quite important. And for Marx, it's the active intervention of the working class, not just commenting, but actually by carrying out protest actions, shaping and confronting the high politics and the foreign policy. And it's interesting that this is a really quite an important feature. If we think of the British working class movement as being largely concerned with sort of bread and butter issues, as often being sort of put forward, then the role of workers' solidarity movements, and even I would say, you know, the fairly sort of lib-lab trade union leaders often were very clearly in support of and opposed to repressive governments overseas and in Europe. I mean, that might fit in with the interests of the British ruling class on occasion. So, you know, that it's not that they were always standing out against it, but in the case of the American Civil War, they were. So the American Civil War, I think, is quite an important example for Marx of how this reawakening movement, as he calls it, can become actually a force. And he talks in the address about the role of this movement in what he calls the mastery of high politics, that it should now begin to be considered a power in and of itself. And indeed, the way that the International acts, it acts as if it is, in a sense, an international player. And you will see this, for example, when it sends letters and addresses to President Lincoln. Again, there's one of them that are put up there. And it does achieve a lot of publicity and indeed gets a response from President Lincoln. So this, I think, is again saying that the working class is a force in the world and not just a force for demanding wage increases and its share, but in a sense, it has its own political interests. And, you know, that I think is quite important. Now, the General Council, it's elected. If you look at the rules of the provisional rules, you'll see how it's laid out. It is in a sense, essentially though, a body that is centered in London. It has, it's made up of delegates who are resident in London and in a sense are, you know, political exiles. So although it has corresponding secretaries, as they're referred to, from particular countries who do maintain links with the particular countries where the International has a presence, in many ways, the General Council is quite a central body. And in that sense, I think it does tell us something about both how Marx and others see the development of a party or a movement as opposed to simply just relying upon its spontaneous growth. The center or the leaders of that and the leading figures are the people who are in a sense defining the politics. Now they do that in interaction with their comrades throughout the world, initially, you know, primarily in Europe, although very quickly they develop links with North America as well. But they see the development of any movement as relying upon the development of a particular program, and the rules of the provisional rules do outline, you know, the clear aims about the self-emancipation of the working class, and that is the task of the working class, that, you know, which is now sort of embodied and emboldened on, you know, most left-wing programs, is the key aim of the International in that way. But of course, it's as a movement, it's variable both in quality and nature. We do have figures and data about memberships, you know, the nature of this movement. It was primarily, certainly for much of its life before the late 1860s, it was primarily a delegate and affiliate body. Its main strength lay in affiliates in Britain, trade unions, probably an affiliated membership of between 30 and 50,000, of similar types of affiliations in France, much weaker affiliations in Germany, and also some in Belgium, particularly in the industrial areas of Wallonia, and also in the French-speaking areas of Switzerland, but also in the German areas too, to a certain extent. Individual membership was actually quite small. And this again is where this movement has, I think, its contradictions, and it's very clearly a movement that's developing. So the individual membership in Britain may well have been as low as 350 people, and some of the reports from Germany in the middle to late 1860s suggest quite small memberships. For example, 20 members in Leipzig, 15 in Cologne. So quite small memberships in that way. It also, I suppose, had different, different sort of patterns of appeal. So for many of the trade unionists, and this was particularly true of many of the Swiss trade unionists, they saw the International initially as a sort of workers' defense organization, so that in a period of strikes they would receive both assistance, monetary assistance, but also that they might prevent blacklegs and scabbing in general. Whereas other groupings saw the politics of this much more clearly, and indeed also saw the International as a sort of educative organization. Marx certainly saw that. He, again, the minutes tell us, spent a great deal both in the General Council meetings but elsewhere organizing lectures, particularly on Marxist conceptions of economics, and banging home the basic sort of differentiations between capitalist economics and the capitalist class and the interests of the workers in that way. But also, Marx wanted to, in a sense, show to the working class, the potential that they had. And this again meant, a certain amount of publicity. And indeed, the address to President Lincoln did receive coverage in the Times, as did the Polish agitation. So again, you can see here that this is a movement which is sort of taking on recognizably modern forms. The other elements in the movement, which will become more important, I think, later, and we will look at when we come to talk about Germany, are the various workers' education groupings. In Germany, the working class movement did arise often from bourgeois liberal educational bodies, and these often study circles then began to look at politics in the wider sense, and many of these became affiliated to the International. But also they were the basis for those larger parties, which we will consider as a separate topic, and their relationship to the International, the Lassallians, and then the people known generally as Eisenachers, people from central Germany. They also have relationships with the International. Marx is, quite intimately involved in the organization of this group. He attends meetings. If comrades ever get a chance to look at the minute books, there's a certain sort of familiarity. Those comrades who, for example, are on the Labour Left Alliance steering group may want to look at the minutes and just wonder whether we've come much further than 1864 when we look at the nature of what's being discussed about fundraising, about organizing meetings, and indeed even a drearily familiar topic, the quality of printing. Again, at one of the early meetings, there's a complaint about the quality of the membership cards and their return to the printers on the grounds that they're just not up to scratch. And the bit I particularly enjoyed was the looking at the London conference, which was the first real conference of the International in 1865, is the social arrangements. Tea would be available from 6 o'clock. There would be a dance. There would be music. So those of you who like your mazorskas or waltzes, you've had plenty of chance to strut your stuff in a rather respectable Victorian manner in 1865. We're also informed that wine, spirits, stout and beer would be available at tavern prices. So you can see that this is an organization that has a real political life, and it is it's developing, it's drawing on all of its different traditions. And in the case of London, those traditions, because the International is centered there, are often drawn from the exile groupings, from people who've been in England for quite a while, but also the native working class as well, who are being drawn into political activity. Marx did not attend many of the congresses. The way that he functioned, and this was often for issues of health, but also it's often was quite dangerous, I think, to travel on the continent. Indeed, so we will discover later on in another session, governments would repress, the International suppress its newspapers, arrest people, and particularly after the time of the Paris Commune. The way that Marx seems to have worked, and I think again it's interesting in terms of wanting to establish a sort of record, and above all develop, I suppose, a position, was through working with groups of comrades, and in particular developing, I suppose, a sort of support base and putting ideas on paper or in pamphlet form. And a good example of how this would sort of function is a document that was used at the Geneva Conference of 1866. Again, it's called sort of Instructions for General Council Delegates. And what this is sort of an outline of positions that the General Council should take in relation to the debates that are coming up. And this is a good example of the type of political debates, and indeed the very sharp differences that emerge in the International. Next week, Ian is going to look at the issue of the anarchist and Bakunin. But before those battles open up in the late 1860s, Marx's ideas are starting to run into opposition from an older source, the Proudhonists, particularly based in France, but also some in other parts of Southern Europe and also in Switzerland as well. And his instructions, the instructions given to the delegates of the General Council at the Congress, sort of outline a set of positions and arguments, and they do, in a sense, represent a program for the International. And they talk about the importance of the struggle for reforms, and in particular, the struggle to secure legislation to secure workers' rights around working hours and conditions and so on. But they argue that the struggle for reforms is, part of the struggle. And this is interesting in the sense that it runs counter to the Proudhonist view that legislation and indeed immediate struggles, strikes in particular, are not only, fruitless, but actually quite counterproductive. Also, Marx argues that the trade unions are a sort of growing, throw up the growing possibility of developing political consciousness, and that the sign of workers' organization will be the first sign towards a more developed political consciousness. And again, this is where we come to this debate about, how far Marx is prepared to cooperate with bodies which are clearly not revolutionary, and are also, in the case of many of the British leaders, will eventually become sort of open collaborators with the Liberal Party, particularly after the Second Reform Act of 1867, when sections of the Labour aristocracy get the vote. But Marx still sees the growth of these unions, and indeed the trade unions, as some sort of potential basis for working class organisation. Above all, I think that what we're getting here is also the importance, again, of the political agency of the working class, and that the working class has to take its own independent position. In a number of discussions, particularly before the Franco-Prussian War, for example, the position that's going to be taken on the Austro-Prussian War, there's a discussion about whether groups of workers should side with one state or another. And the idea of the workers taking their own position and not simply saying that's the job of the state leaders, we don't have a position on this, I think is important. Marx is constantly stressing that this, this has to be done in that way. Now, the Proudhonists were quite a strong force, but they were politically defeated, and certainly after the Brussels Conference of 1868, they had, in a sense, retreated. Many of their supporters, particularly in France, had either deserted the movement or had, moved closer towards Marx's position. Now, Marx worked with a number of allies, and increasingly from the late 1860s, those allies are to be found in Germany, and of course in amongst the British trade unionists. I use the phrase English because that's the one that comes up, and in fact, to call them English isn't really accurate. Many of the unions and many of the affiliates are actually throughout what was then the United Kingdom. But the habit of referring to Great Britain or the United Kingdom as England is one that comes through in the texts. So I'm afraid I've kept it, but I'm sure comrades will understand in that way. So I've sort of drawn towards the end of the period I want to look at, which is really getting the International up and running. It has an existence. Its membership is various. It's run on a shoestring, and although there are lurid revelations about the International having £500,000 at its disposal, the Times runs various exposés, or that it is an army of millions just poised to rise up and murder the bourgeoisie in their beds. And this sort of story does the rounds, particularly at the time of the Paris Commune. In practice, the movement is patchy, but what I think it is evidence of Marx is an attempt to develop revolutionary ideas in a new movement that is starting to take place. And he does that with really the forces that are at hand. He does that, I think, as well, remaining fairly consistent to the ideas that he puts forward in the Communist Manifesto. It's very clear, for example, in his educational talks that he gives, that there's absolutely no concession to bourgeois ideas. And it's also clear that his focus on politics and that the working class movement has to be more than just around, economic demands is also there. But I think it will be more interesting to look at the debate which will take place when the German socialists, many of whom were had a rather arm's length relationship with the International initially, how they began to organize, and then how that began to influence Marx and Engels in terms of how they saw development of party and program. So I see this as a period in which ideas are developing, and I think Marx is definitely building on the experience. But as he said in his letter in November 1864, these are real powers, and how we orientate to those powers is, I think, quite important. So I'll leave it there and throw it open to questions and discussion. I'm afraid I think I've spoken a little longer than I intended. So.
No worries, you weren't there last week, so you used the slot from last week as well, because you were off poorly. Thank you very much, Kevin. Really interesting introduction, touching on a lot of issues that, as you say, will no doubt come back in the next 10, 12 sessions. Comrades, if you want to make a contribution or have a question, please click raise hand. If you can't find it, it's usually under reactions. If you can't find it, put it in the chat and I'll call you in. It's much better than writing your question in the chat. It's much better to hear how you actually mean it rather than me reading it out. I thought it was really interesting to get the ball rolling, to see that he was quite prepared to stay out of it for a while when the movement was going backward, etc., and use the time, as you said, to preparation for the next period when things are changing again. I've looked up this the quote you mentioned where you said he was talking about the movement is now growing spontaneously. It actually says naturally, which is a slight difference to spontaneously, but that discussion does come up later again, also with
just on that, did you look that up in German?
I can't find it in the German, but it says in the English naturally.
Because my translation, which was one from Franz Mehring, which had been done in the Neue Zeit about 1911, 1912, does use spontaneously. Oh,
because I looked it up on the Internet Archive on that link.
But it might be useful. It might be useful for you, to look at it in German, because one thing I've been very aware. And my German is pretty dreadful, but even no. I can order a beer, but I can't discuss materialism. But it strikes me that often, and often the translations can be, it can be quite significant. And I'm not on about deliberate distortions. I'm on about, just simply simplifications. I'm sure you're aware of this problem because you translate yourself.
Yeah, and we've discussed it last week with the Communist Manifesto, where there was quite a serious mistranslation. We've discussed this about the party question. Should the communists organize in a party, or should they never ever organize separately, etc.? So it's quite a mistranslation. Often, I think it's more sometimes perhaps wishful thinking, or sometimes mostly, just you think that's the right thing because that's where your politics are, and it actually means something totally different. What I did the letter about, he writes about the first international to Engels. I urge comrades to read it. It's quite funny when you read letters that they probably didn't expect perhaps to have published like that, but he is kind of talking about how he maneuvered, because he couldn't attend a couple of meetings, and then so he basically maneuvered because what they produced, the other committee produced, was absolute rubbish, and he went into a editing meeting with, as he says, the clear intention not to let one single line stand of what they put together. And then he sort of, goes for time. Oh, we must spend until midnight to agree on one rule out of 40. And then, it's a shame, it's got no time now. Leave it to me, I'll look over it and stuff. And he changes the whole thing and, rewrites it all. And then they say, you've done exactly what we hoped you would do. You totally tore it up, etc. It's quite funny. It's an entertaining read as well. But on that question, perhaps we could discuss this a little longer. And this is of course the key question, growing spontaneously, growing naturally, or does it need the input of the revolutionaries? This is as you said, what is to be done does talk about that, and but also this comes up now. Where do we fit into the party? Where do the revolutionaries fit into taking what's happening anyway? Workers who come up against the limits of what capitalists are prepared to give them, they will automatically, naturally, spontaneously come up against that. They will want to fight for higher wages, they will want to fight for better working conditions, etc. But how do we get them beyond that, etc.? Will that happen spontaneously? Will that happen naturally? Or is that where you need the party of some sort? And that is also interesting. And perhaps if you could mention that again, is the party wasn't the same party that we're talking about, when we're talking about the Communist Party, when they often write about the party, they meant like the movement for socialism, I guess, those who understand that we have to go beyond the sort of economic self-interest of the workers, and we have to, it's not an inevitability that workers will automatically overthrow capitalism. Quite the opposite is perhaps even, it's not going to happen unless you have a party of organized opposition with a clear understanding what kind of program we need. It's not inevitable, it's not spontaneous, it has to be prepared, it has to be worked for, etc. But that's an interesting discussion, and I presume they came up against those issues as well in the first international. There's a lot of questions in that one question, but perhaps you have a couple of comments before I bring in comrades from the floor.
Yeah, just a quick couple of comments. If you look at the relevant sections of the Communist Manifesto on bourgeois and proletarian, or bourgeois and proletarian, sorry, you can see references there to the development of both militancy, and you can see the arguments about the difference between the proletarian revolution and the bourgeois revolution, particularly the idea of the proletariat as a universal class that by abolishing the conditions of its oppression, abolish oppression in general, whereas the bourgeoisie abolishes its revolution, abolishes the conditions of its oppression, but that's not universalized. It's unclear, I think, in the text of the Communist Manifesto, other than the references to the party, and other than, I think these are quite important points, the critiques of the various forms of socialism. In other words, what Marx thinks is that it's quite important to critique these other socialisms, because it is a battle of ideas, and it isn't just something that can be left to occur naturally. That wrong ideas, incorrect ideas, even reactionary ideas can emerge. So I think that although I think it isn't entirely or as clearly spelled out as it will be later on, I think it's clearly there. I don't think we're imposing that on Marx. In terms of the issue of the party, and indeed of organized politics, this does come up in the First International, not just in terms of some of the English trade unionists, but also in terms of the Proudhonists, who are quite hostile to what they see as intellectuals. And there's a certain sort of workerism, particularly sort of our artisan forms of workerism. And, Marx argues that, people who are committed to the politics of the working class can be members of this movement. Whereas, some want to simply confine it to particular groups of workers. And that, I think, is again a sort of argument that this movement and that the importance of politics goes just beyond mere representation of workers in that way. And I suppose the other lesson, particularly coming out of Chartism, is that although the base of Chartism is that of a mass working class movement, there are many currents within it. Indeed, its origins often lie amongst sections of both the petty bourgeoisie, even indeed, some sections of the bourgeoisie as well. And that, I think, then makes the idea of a battle for establishing a political position quite important. And of course, what the 1848 revolution throws up as well is clearly the distinction between the politics of the working class and the bourgeoisie. And so the idea of, developing that consciousness politically, of raising political demands, and that is carried out by members of the party of this current, is, I think, quite central. I think sorry, I think I'm getting a little bit of an echo there, yeah. So I think, for example, the Proudhonists often do tend towards these ideas of spontaneity. They tend to see many of the developments in capitalism occurring, if I use the word inevitably, that isn't quite how they see it, but it's much less on the active political intervention of revolutionaries. And I think this is the central point. Now, how that's to be done, I think, is evolving in this period. I don't think there's a sort of clear blueprint as yet, but it's clearly not something of just assume that it will, quote, naturally happen. Workers will be impelled into struggle. They may even raise political demands, but that will require, to further those demands and to push them, will require both organization and also program as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Conrad. Okay, now from the floor, we've got a few people with their hands up, so try to keep it succinct, please, comrades. Jerry, please.
Okay, just a few small points. The thing about the propaganda and the mass action, a distinction was made at the time of the Russian Revolution between propaganda for the vanguard and agitation for the masses. So you wrote your Communist Manifesto, or you wrote your big propaganda document in order to win over the vanguard, but you sought to put the masses in action by agitational demands, like all power to the Soviets, or the land, bread and peace, that sort of stuff. So when the workers began to move, you especially put a lot of emphasis on the agitational on the agitational demands. So that's the difference there. So you do then have to have some kind of a link between your agitational demands and your propaganda, and that's what I would call a transitional demand. God save the mark, if it doesn't insult too many people. I think people that say, well, you take what's possible, or you put forward what's needed and not what's possible. You look at what's possible and you find a link between what's possible and what's needed in your whole program. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin, do you want another question, or do you want to answer that?
No, I'll bring a couple together. I think that would help. Yeah.
Yeah. John, please. Oh, we can only see your chest at the moment, John. Could move your camera up a bit. And you have trouble, I think, unmuting. I've sent you, there should be a link on the screen that you have to touch when I click unmute. Doesn't quite work. Shall we try and bring somebody else in and you try and sort it, comrade? Because I don't think we can. Oh, I think I've heard myself. John? Can you try and Nope. Doesn't. Okay. Nick, then please.
Sorry, Tina, was that me?
Yes, yeah, you.
Okay, so there's a bit of an echo.
There is, isn't it? I'll try and sort it. Try now.
Comrade Tina, can you? Yes, that's better. Thank you, Tina. And thank you particularly to Kevin. I thought that was a really interesting discussion and a really good exposition about the First International. And I wanted to try and make some links between today and the First International, and to address some misapplications, as I see it anyway, of the lessons of the First International to how Marxists should intervene in the movement today. So I hope that's not taking things in a different direction at all. But I want to preface the remarks by saying that you can't look at Marx's life without seeing his role in the First International and his achievement in the First International. I think Engels called it at one stage his crowning achievement, which is a bit strange given that he wrote Capital. But it was certainly seen by Engels, and I think by Marx at the time, as being extremely important. So I'm not seeking to minimize it at all. And the point that I want to address is that at the moment, when people are looking around for what sort of party we should be building now, they look back, this is some Marxists, look back at the First International and say, well, Marx in the First International used his sort of Marx party, the people around Marx, his colleagues, his co-thinkers like Engels and Wolff and so on. And they used that, but they related to British trade union leaders, and they intervened in a movement that contained people that didn't agree with them. And that's what we should be trying to do now. Now, in my opinion, we communists are part of the working class, and we are not apart from the working class. So it's always important that communists relate to discussion, debate, and particularly activity in the working class. But how we do that in the present day, we can't simply just look back to Marx and Engels and see their participation in the First International as being a prototype or a model to follow for today, because that would ignore, in essence, 150, 160 years that has taken place since then, and try to apply the method that Marx used to intervene to promote communist ideas in the movement at the time to what we and how we do it today. And it's interesting that after Marx died, Engels wrote to Frederick Sorge, and he said, I think the next international, after Marx's writings have been at work for some years, will be directly communistic and will openly proclaim our principles. And that's clearly what was intended and what was expected and what was hoped for in the Second International, and particularly with the German party and the Erfurt program and so on, for all the criticisms, or some of the criticisms that can be directed at that. And again, when Marx told Engels that he was going to get involved in this movement, which became the International Working Men's Association, the First International, Engels initially, wrongly, was quite skeptical, but he did say, we're going to have to break with these people at some stage. And Marx said, yes, that's true, but not yet. And so it's trying to see, well, where are we now? Because we don't just have the experience of the First International. That collapsed through a combination of differences and so on. Marx and Engels and the General Council moved the headquarters to New York because of the coming to the end, actually, of that wave that you've talked about. And then we had the Second International, the movement with Marxist parties. We then have August 1914 and the capitulation of social democracy. We then have the Third International, we have Stalinism, and we have the position today. So a whole lot of history has gone through. So the point that I'm getting to is that the argument that I would put forward today is that communists need their own party. And that doesn't mean a sectarian party that doesn't engage in the class struggle, but it means a party that argues for communist ideas, because I agree with Kevin and with you, Tina, that the conclusions that workers draw are not necessarily revolutionary or communistic. They may be, but they may take a long time to get there. And what is needed is a communist party, an organized communist force that intervenes and brings the good news of communism or socialism to the class. And if you look at what Marx was trying to do in the First International, it's quite amazing, really, how much he was able to get the First International to agree to. And in those provisional rules that Kevin talked about, I too have got the same minutes. It's fantastic two-volume book, but the provisional rules of the association start out by saying, considering, and this is basically why the First International, that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. Right, so that's an amazing achievement for 1864. It's not even accepted by the social democratic or the trade union movement now in 2023. And he goes on, and it's slightly different, as Kevin said, it's slightly emoliated versions of the Communist Manifesto, but it's the same concept. He says in paragraph 2, that the economical subjection of the man of labor to the monopolizer of the means of labor, that is, the sources of life, lies at the bottom of servitude in all its forms. Basically, he's saying capitalism is at the root of all the evils in society. And he's got all of these disparate forces to agree that. We'd be hard pressed to find a unified group of workers today to agree to that particular concept. And that, to me, brings home why we need an organized communist force to present in various different ways through agitation and propaganda, but resolutely and confidently putting the arguments of Marx. So when Marx used that Latin motto, strong in deed or strong in the thing, you could also say strong in the argument, but softly or gently in the manner. He's prepared to, dress it up a little bit, but he's absolutely intransigent on the question of the politics of it. And he fights several, in fact, multiple battles, from the Proudhonists to the Lassalleans to the trade union leaders and so on, for his communist point of view. Whereas what we have at the moment, unfortunately, and I'll finish on this point, is some Marxists who aren't arguing for a new party in which they argue for their ideas, but for a new party in which they subordinate their ideas to the trade union left bureaucracy, which I think is a big mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Kevin, I suggest you reply to some of the issues from the first two speakers.
Yeah. We will, Jerry, get on to talk about, I think, the Russian Revolution, and indeed, I'm hoping that the discussion on that will take that form. I mean, what I hope to do in the sessions here is really just outline the history, and I think the distinction between propaganda and agitation is interesting, and I think I would agree with your with your point about how that operated in the Russian Revolution, and indeed in the preparations for that. But I think that at the stage that we are here in the 1860s, I think that Marx is probably still working more in terms of looking at the vanguard. I think that becomes quite clear as well in terms of how he operates, that he is still trying to build up a current of thought around his ideas, and he's doing this with limited resources, limited numbers. In terms of building a revolutionary instrument, such as the Bolsheviks had, I think that's only going to appear to be on the agenda when we start to look at the Paris Commune, and indeed later. But I'm not sidestepping the question on transitional politics. I mean, I think it's really the subject of another talk, particularly when we come to look at the the airport program, that the whole idea of the minimum and maximum and what that means. But I think that it is an important point, because I think that in Marx at this stage, even those distinctions are not clear. You know, when we look at the rules and the program that Nick referred to there. I would agree with much of what Nick said, and I don't particularly want to go too far down the road. It's not that I want to avoid talking about the contemporary, because I would generally agree with what Nick said about the nature of a communist party and a specifically Marxist project. But I do think that the argument that we just simply go back and look at what Marx did and then we repeat it is not indeed what Marx did. He didn't go back and repeat what he did in 1848. And he also didn't go back and repeat what previous groups of revolutionaries had done. So he was, in a sense, looking at the real movement that existed and how he was going to, intervene in that. I think the emphasis on an education and indeed what Marx and Engels thought they were doing with the First International is, I suppose, in many ways educative. And I don't mean that in the sort of academic sense, but you're attempting to break the hold of bourgeois ideology. And the sections that you read, and I did refer to the one on the emancipation of the working class, that runs counter to both the political economy of the Proudhonists, but also to those of the British trade union leaders, who might well have seen the idea of emancipation as simply workers securing their fair share in that way. So it is quite a clear challenge to them. And I think, interestingly, it's one that will come under a certain strain. And indeed, in the case of the trade union leaders, many of them will drift off. Howell, who's one of the members of the General Council in the 1870s, becomes a Liberal MP, Lib-Lab MP. In terms of breaking and knowing when to break and so on, Marx, I think, had been through that experience with Chartism. And remember that the Chartist movement, after its defeat, and it goes into decline, goes into all sorts of strange forms. And indeed, I think it's in the letter, that one of the letters I've quoted, where Marx talks about his views on some of the Chartist leaders, and particularly the ones, I think it's Ernest Jones that and Harney that he'd not been in contact with. And so there's a clear idea that on occasions, or indeed that unless people are, in a sense, within your current, within your party, within the Marx party, if you want to call it that, then there will be these distinctions. And it was very clear, for example, when I tried to make the point about the instructions to the Geneva Conference, that the Proudhonists, that Marx was not going to allow any real concessions to them. And of course, this will be even more so with Bakunin in the next section, which Ian will look at in that way. As for the sort of lessons, well, I think I would prefer to see we look at least the first two internationals, and we sort of take lessons from those. I mean, the third international, I think, again, quite a lot there, but I think we also have to sort of acknowledge where we are. We're not in the world of the 1850s and 1860s. And I suppose that we have to recognize, for example, that there's a whole lot of historical experience. I mean, the experience of Stalinism, for example, the development of mass working class organizations, development of capitalism. I mean, I can go on for ages about saying, well, what we've got to take into account. But what I think we perhaps can learn from this is that what Marx is clearly trying to do is to move beyond narrow circles, and that in particular, and this will, I think, will become apparent in the next talk and in the sections on German social democracy, make those clear delineations that Nick refers to. I mean, in terms of the situation today, I think it would be good, perhaps at the end of the series, to sort of focus on that. I don't want to say, that was then, this is now, and don't bring it in. And I think it does have some sort of lessons, and it is quite useful, but it's clearly not a blueprint. But it does, I think, give us some sort of guide, and it also talks about how we might operate in a situation when the space for revolutionary politics is very limited. So I'll leave it there for the minute.
Yep, thank you, Kevin. Victor, please, and then Matthew.
Good evening, comrades. It's occurred to me that Marxism is almost meaningless if you do not first grasp the concept of an overwhelming majority mass of workers and proletariat being exploited by a small bourgeois minority of capitalists who are trying to exploit, manipulate, and control. Not to accept that concept and call yourself a Marxist is almost like not believing in a monarchy but calling yourself a monarchist, not believing in Christ but calling yourself a Christian, not believing in racism but calling yourself part of the Ku Klux Klan, or calling yourself a Stalinist if you don't believe in Stalin. The idea of the capitalist bourgeois minority exploiting the proletariat and the workers is at the core of Marxist thinking. However, though we've been discussing in great minutiae the history of Marxist activity and thinking in great detail, we have very little discussion on the nature of the modern capitalist conspiracy to control workers, their welfare, and power in society today. This has been brought home to us by the rise of here, I prefer Davos stormtrooper, who, besides preferring Davos, a topic that the mainstream media refuses to question him about, a secretive organisation that you and I will never be allowed to go within a mile of, because it's exclusively for selected capitalist bosses and their tame politicians to discuss what they're going to do to us in secret. He is also a member of the Trilateral Commission, another secretive organisation of capitalists. Gets its name because it's based in Japan, Europe and North America, of people who feel there's too much democracy, too much women's rights, too much workers' rights. If we'd have been more familiar with these secretive capitalist controlling organisations that operate behind the scenes, perhaps so many of us wouldn't have been fooled and betrayed by Starmer in the way that we were. Do you think that we need to bring our Marxism up to date and consider this fundamental core aspect of Marxism in some greater detail, comrades.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Matthew, please.
Just a few, try and get a few points very briefly. I think I agree with a lot of what Nick has said. I'll just say that we should take that point that he makes about Marx talking about the working class and the need for the issue as the core of the basically to end the class society itself, not really capitalism, but all class society. Actually goes back to at least the 1840s, and is actually core to Marx's break with Hegelianism. And the whole question is live, obviously, because what we've got obviously is a whole series of sets of people basically breaking from that basis to say, well, the task of the working class is to liberate humanity towards support for Stalinism or Scottish nationalism or NATO or whatever else, other such nonsense. But that's happening all the time, unfortunately. I think the other thing that's interesting in Marx, of course, is that Marx, of course, is very good at writing things. He writes an extraordinary amount. His writings are actually tons in weight of paper, but he's very, very bad at publishing any of it. I mean, the thing is obviously that the great thing about he actually publishes Capital during his own lifetime. Although it's 5 years late at least. I mean, being Marx's publisher actually drove people to distraction. But I mean, much of his work is not published, for many decades after his death. I mean, Grundrisse, which is essential work, is not actually available till after the Second World War. I mean, not even the Comintern have access to Grundrisse. So you can see. I mean, we're in the privileged position of having a lot more Marx available, than previous generations as well. And then we take that into account. The other thing I think that in terms of what's happening in terms of First International is what you're seeing is these two great mass movements. The worst of which, of course, is the Civil War in the US, which is a mass movement. I mean, there is obviously in the British working class. I mean, what you see is a big campaign against slavery. I mean, you have US anti-slavery campaigners coming over, running tours for decades in all the way around the UK, and winning support and so on and so forth. And therefore, there's political preparation for this support for the North against the slavery, and the fact that actually, of course, I mean, the US Civil War itself is this mass movement against slavery. The US is able to, as a country without nothing like the population it's got now, able to raise an army of 2 million men, mostly men. I mean, there were a few disguised women, but mostly men, on a volunteer basis. I mean, virtually, they did pass a conscription act, but virtually nobody was conscripted. Over 90% of all that army was volunteer, because people wanted to fight to get rid of slavery. So you have that. At the same time also, but that actually is what impels Lincoln, who was very reluctant to actually announce the Emancipation Proclamation, this armed movement behind him. So okay, in 1863 he announces this, the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, which is both summary act of human liberation, massive act of human liberation, and at the same time a huge act of expropriation. It expropriates, all of these southern planters. It's immense in historical terms. It's quite huge. This is why why Marx and Engels are so effusive about it, I think. At the same time, also, of course, that movement then forces Lincoln to allow black men to join the army, and also not only to join the army but to have equal pay. Although unfortunately the U.S. Army remains a segregated institution until after the Second World War, but they were finally able to carry arms and receive the same pay as everybody else. So there's that. And that's happening. That's important to the First International. And then, of course, obviously, even more central, of course, is the Paris Commune, in which the members of the International actually play a central role. I mean, the members of the Commune, unfortunately, mostly Proudhonists, but there's then this sort of day and day debate between Marx, Engels, and the actual leadership of the Commune. Which is an amazing, sort of experience, that it's a live experience of, you know, running the first workers' revolution. That you know, you have a live debate between, you know, Marx obviously writing up all the lessons that you can see, and at the same time debating it out with the actual leadership. So, you know, it was an extraordinarily productive thing, and I think that's, you know, it's really incredibly useful in terms of the political development of everybody concerned. Thanks.
Thank you, comrade. And Paul wants to speak, but I think he might have a problem with his camera. I've allowed you to talk, so we can hear you now if you want to speak. Paul Smith, please.
That's okay, Tina.
Hi. It's okay, you don't want to speak?
That's right.
Oh, okay, sorry, I misunderstood. You've got your hand up, but I think that might have been a mistake. Okay, Kevin, do you want to reply to a few things that were raised in the discussion then, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with Matthew. Thanks, Matthew, for that, and also your chat comments on the American Civil War, which saved me a job, as it were. But I think you're quite right on the revolutionary impact of that war. And when you just set out the terms of it in terms of an act of human liberation and undermining, you know, an absolutely repulsive reactionary, but integral part of capitalism. You know, this wasn't some sort of antique thing stuck away in an obscure corner of the world. It was directly linked to British capitalism. You know, the cotton which flows from the southern states comes into Liverpool and then is sent into the mills of Lancashire and to the warehouses of Manchester. You know, I would just a sort of small sort of local reference where I live in Liverpool. It's not generally known, but it I think does deserve to be remembered that Liverpool's record on the American Civil War is pretty atrocious. Because if people on the Clyde were building ships, well, people on the other side of the Mersey built the Alabama, at least that, you know, the famous commerce raider. And indeed, I think probably about 50% of the crew of the Alabama came from Merseyside. The local bourgeoisie, commercial bourgeoisie in Liverpool backed the Confederacy. In 1863-64, I think, they held a great big fundraiser in St. George's Hall, and they raffled Stonewall Jackson's hat as a sort of prize. So, you know, alongside the heroism of the Lancashire workers and their political initiative and that of the First International, there were sections of the British bourgeoisie who were quite willing to uphold, you know, that foul system. And, you know, one of the things there about, you know, contemporary discussions on slavery and indeed, you know, imperialism in general is the idea that somehow British capitalism and liberal democracy is the antithesis. You know, the British bourgeoisie were fully behind the Confederacy. But I think the revolutionary impact, and in particular, not only the role of the First International and comrades in this country, but also many of the so-called Red 48ers in the American Army. I mean, you know, the Union Army was full of veterans of 1848. And indeed, I think Germans should get a particular mention there because of that. Many of the middle-ranking and general officers were veterans of 1848. So the impact of the American Civil War, I think, is quite significant, you know, and it can be sort of played down a little bit as peripheral, but I think you brought it to the center in an important way. For those comrades who are interested, there is a very general sort of bourgeois history book, you know, it's almost a sort of bestseller, but it's called A World on Fire. It was written, I think, about 5, maybe 10 years ago, and it's about Britain's connections with the American Civil War. And I think it's quite useful, you know, as a reminder. I particularly enjoyed not only the embarrassment of the Gladstone family with William Gladstone's support for the Confederacy on grounds of self-determination. So those people in the Ukraine Solidarity campaign have got a nice long glorious antecedents of backing reactionary causes using that slogan, but also the Guardian, which backed the South. It did put it in its recent centenary edition, or bicentenary editions, but it just makes the point that the sections of the bourgeoisie were didn't have clean hands in that way. I left off the Paris Commune, Matthew, because that's going to be a separate issue, and I deliberately just did the earlier part. Victor, you talk about an analysis of contemporary capitalism, and I agree with you. I mean, the documents that we've looked at, and this is an historical session, not because it's an academic idea, let's have a nice little bit of history, but because I think that we're looking at the development of Marxism. And Marx, when he writes that inaugural address, does go straight for the exploitation of the working class, and he goes straight for pointing out the difference between the growth of the British economy, and he uses all the figures from British official documents. So he goes straight for that, and I think you're right to do that as well. What he's also doing, and this refers back to some of the earlier questions, is he's also challenging the hold of bourgeois ideas in the labour movement, both Proudhonist ideas, but also amongst British trade union leaders, many of whom might be quite militant in securing would try to be quite militant to secure a good deal for their members, but would not accept the idea of the fundamental nature of capitalism. So they might see capitalism and indeed profit as sort of almost eternally ordained. And when Marx is using that line about bourgeois political economy, he's actually challenging them. And again, I think that's important because the points you make about Starmer and indeed trade union leaders, and indeed what we might think of the whole pro-capitalist wing of the leadership of our movement, also have to be challenged in the same way. Where I think that I would not emphasize so much, but it's this is I suppose because I'm looking at Marxism as his historical development, is, for example, the role today of individual leaders and indeed groups that you refer to, which I've been aware of their existence, meetings of capitalists and groupings and so on. I think some of the first comments on those sorts of things occurred in the early 70s. I think that what Marx is arguing is not about secret organizations or indeed the role of the ruling class in trying to suppress the movement. It's actually developing the consciousness in the working class. And that is our big issue. There is at the moment no alternative for workers. And so in the coming general election, they will either have to vote for Starmer or maybe or abstain or indeed vote for some small left candidate. But essentially, workers are presented with two wings of capitalism in that sense. The Labour Party, which is a bourgeois workers' party still, has a leadership that's committed to capitalism. And it's had a leadership committed to capitalism from its very inception in 1900, because it grew out of the very same trade union leaders that Marx is challenging with his views on bourgeois political economy. So, Starmer is a particularly odious example of that. Tony Blair was an odious example, but they're part of a long line of reformist leaders. And our function, I think, is to challenge the ideas of reformism and that capitalism can be reformed and that labourism and that type of politics can give any permanent gains for workers. So you know, the focus on Starmer is important, but it's not Starmer, and it's not, I think, cabals and secrecies. It's actually the capitalist system, and it's the structure of bourgeois politics. And that, again, I think, is what Marx was attempting to do, and what I think Marxists should attempt to do. You know, is to raise up the points in that way, and particularly, you know, to begin the process of raising revolutionary consciousness. But you know, that's really the heart of all of these talks.
Yeah. Very good summing up. Thank you very much, Kevin. There's nobody else with their hands up, so we're finishing about a little bit earlier than usual. That's not a big problem at all. Thank you for joining us. Next week, Ian Spencer will be looking at what happened with the First International. We've just discussed today how Marx was centrally involved in setting it up, writing the rules, etc., getting very much involved. And it came to a split, which was discussed. We mentioned that today, but next week we'll focus on that debate, which is still happening today, that debate between, you know, it's pointless going on strikes, pointless going fighting for reforms, etc. So it'll be an interesting discussion. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you all for coming along. Good night.